The morning my husband tried to erase me from my son's life. He smiled. He didn't just ask for a divorce. He asked the court to declare me unstable, unfit, a risk to my own child. I remember the way the fluorescent lights buzzed above us in that Massachusetts family courtroom. How the air felt too thin to breathe. Mark sat across the aisle in a navy suit I had helped him pick out for corporate conferences. His posture relaxed, almost bored. Rebecca sat beside him, polished and composed, a leather folder resting neatly on her lap like she was attending a routine meeting instead of helping dismantle a family. When his attorney stood up and said, "We are seeking full legal and physical custody due to concerns regarding the mother's emotional instability," something inside my chest went hollow. I had built my life around my son, and now I was being reduced to a liability. Mark didn't look at me when the word unstable was spoken. He didn't need to. He already believed he had won. What he didn't know was that this wasn't the first time I had been underestimated. And it wouldn't be the last. I'm Jennifer Collins. I was 36 when my marriage collapsed in a way I never saw coming. I used to manage social media strategy for mid-sized brands in Boston. Campaign launches, engagement metrics, audience growth, those were the things I understood. I was fast, creative, adaptable. When Mark and I first married, he told everyone how lucky he was to have a wife who knew the digital world inside out. Mark worked as an IT support specialist for a financial services firm. Reliable, predictable, the man who fixed everyone else's systems while quietly building his own stability. When our son Anthony was born, everything shifted. I chose to transition into freelance work from home. It made sense at the time. Flexible hours, school pickups, doctor appointments, science fair projects. From the outside, we looked like the ideal suburban family in a quiet town outside Boston. 2-story colonial, trimmed hedges, a boy who loved robotics and read above his grade level, a marriage that seemed calm, even steady. But stability can be staged. The first real change wasn't dramatic. It was subtle. Mark began insisting on handling all major financial decisions because, as he put it, "You already have enough on your plate." I told myself it was practical, efficient, logical. Then our joint accounts became something I could view but not move. He set up automated transfers for budgeting purposes. I received a fixed monthly allowance for household expenses. He framed it as organization. I framed it as trust. Until one afternoon, when my debit card declined at the grocery store, I stood there, Anthony beside me, as the cashier repeated, "I'm sorry." "Ma'am?" It says insufficient funds. My cheeks burned. Mark later explained it was a temporary fraud hold. It happened again the following month. Around that same time, my freelance clients started disappearing. One long-term brand emailed saying they were concerned about consistency. Another said they had received anonymous complaints questioning my professionalism. I blamed the algorithm, the economy. Myself? I didn't blame my husband. The night he asked for a divorce was strangely calm. Anthony was asleep. The dishwasher hummed in the kitchen. Mark sat across from me and said, "This isn't working anymore. And I think it would be best for Anthony if we structured things properly." Structured. That was his word. 2 days later, I was served with formal divorce papers. Not just dissolution of marriage. A petition for full custody. Attached was a statement alleging emotional instability, erratic income, and an inability to provide a stable environment. I read the phrase pattern of emotional volatility 3 times before it made sense. My grief over my mother's hospitalization last year. My tears after losing a major contract. A photo of my kitchen messy during a week I had the flu. Screenshots of text messages where I said I was exhausted. Evidence. That was what he called it. Rebecca Shaw's name appeared in the filings as a consultant. 33. Legal assistant. Organized. Articulate. Precise. She had attended our son's school fundraiser 6 months earlier. She had smiled at me, complimented my presentation board, asked thoughtful questions about how I balanced work and motherhood. Now I understood. She hadn't been curious. She had been collecting When I confronted Mark about the college savings account, the one we had built slowly over 9 years, he didn't deny moving it. He said it was reallocated for strategic investment. Nearly $200,000 had been transferred into a newly formed consulting entity. The registered agent on that entity was Rebecca. That was the moment the betrayal shifted from personal to deliberate. It wasn't an affair alone. It was planning. The court date was set within weeks. Temporary custody arrangements were requested. Mark's attorney emphasized stability, structure, predictability. I was framed as unpredictable. What frightened me most wasn't losing money. It wasn't the house. It wasn't even the humiliation. It was the thought of Anthony being relocated. Mark had already mentioned career opportunities in Colorado. Colorado. As if geography were just another spreadsheet cell to move. The night before our first hearing, I stood in Anthony's doorway watching him sleep. His desk lamp cast a soft glow over half-built robotics pieces scattered on his floor. His small chest rose and fell evenly. Unaware that adults were arguing over his future like property, I whispered a promise into the dark. I would not be erased. They thought I was too emotional, too distracted, too dependent. They mistook quiet for weakness. What they didn't understand was that when you push a mother into a corner, you don't break her. You teach her how to fight. The first time I realized this divorce was a strategy, not a separation, was when I saw Rebecca's name printed in bold beneath the words registered agent. I had driven to the county clerk's office myself. I didn't trust screenshots anymore. I didn't trust summaries. I needed paper, ink, proof that could not be deleted with a password. The clerk slid the document across the counter without looking up. A newly formed consulting entity, filed 4 months before I was served. The business address traced back to a shared executive suite in downtown Boston. Clean, professional, invisible. And there it was. Rebecca Shaw. Not as a witness, not as a bystander. As the legal architect, my hands didn't shake. I was surprised by that. I had expected rage, tears, something dramatic. Instead, I felt clarity. 4 months before the divorce filing meant this had begun while we were still attending parent-teacher conferences together. While I was scheduling Anthony's dentist appointments. While I was sending Mark drafts of holiday card captions. I replayed every interaction with Rebecca in my mind. The school fundraiser in October. She had stood beside Mark at the silent auction table, wearing a charcoal blazer and speaking about family court reform trends like it was a hobby. She asked me how I handled freelance income documentation for tax purposes. At the time, I thought she was making conversation. Now I understood she had been assessing vulnerabilities. 2 days later, I received a formal motion from Mark's attorney requesting an emergency temporary custody hearing. Emergency. The word made my stomach twist. The attached exhibits were worse than the original filing. There were annotated timelines of my so-called emotional episodes. Dates and times I had cried. Text messages I had sent at midnight saying I felt overwhelmed. Screenshots of bank notifications showing fluctuating deposits from freelance clients. There was even a draft psychological summary attached, suggesting I displayed markers of emotional dysregulation under stress. The language was clinical, structured, detached. Rebecca's fingerprints were all over it. I sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Anthony did his homework, and read the document line by line until the words blurred. It wasn't just that Mark was divorcing me. He was building a case to remove me. That afternoon, I opened my laptop and began searching Rebecca's background more carefully. Public records don't hide much if you know how to look. 3 years earlier, she had been involved in her own custody dispute. The filings were public. It had been bitter, contentious. She had lost primary custody due to relocation complications and compliance disputes. The details were sparse, but the undertone was clear. She had lost control once, and now she was helping someone else win it. That realization chilled me more than the affair ever had. Mark wasn't just cheating. He was collaborating. Within days, the financial pressure tightened. Our shared credit card suddenly declined. Utilities were shifted into his name only for billing efficiency. When I logged into our joint account, I could see transactions but not initiate transfers. When I asked him about it, he said calmly, my attorney recommended separating financial exposure during proceedings. Exposure. As if I were a risk. Groceries became something I had to request reimbursement for. School supplies required documentation. I felt like an employee filing expense reports in my own home. Anthony noticed, "Why do you have to ask Dad before buying stuff?" he asked one evening while I was comparing prices on my phone. "It's just temporary," I said, forcing lightness into my voice. Temporary was becoming a theme. I met with my own attorney the following week. A woman in her early 50s with sharp eyes and a quiet way of listening that made you want to be honest. She read the filings without interrupting. When she finished, she folded her hands and said, "They're building a narrative." "I can see that," I replied. "Family court takes emotional instability seriously," she continued. "If they frame you as volatile and financially dependent, that can influence temporary custody decisions. Temporary again. What do I need?" I asked. "Evidence," she said simply. "And possibly a forensic accountant. If assets were moved prior to disclosure, that changes everything. Forensic accountant meant money I wasn't sure I could access. It meant escalation. But it also meant light. That night, Mark tried to provoke me. He mentioned Colorado casually while washing dishes. "There's an opportunity there. Higher salary. Better schools. For you," I said evenly. "For Anthony," he corrected. His tone was rehearsed. Calm. Controlled. He referenced documentation twice during the conversation, as if he were reminding me that anything I said could be catalogued. I understood then. He wanted reaction. He wanted tears. Raised voice. Proof. So I gave him none. I nodded. I asked neutral questions. I said good night. Later, when I walked past his office, I saw his laptop screen lit. An open folder titled Court Evidence. Inside were subfolders labeled by month. Screenshots. PDFs. Notes. He had been collecting me. Every vulnerable moment. Every exhausted confession. Every human imperfection. I stepped back before he could notice me standing there. Upstairs, Anthony was still awake. He looked up from his desk when I entered. "Dad's been writing stuff down a lot," he said quietly. "Even when you cry." My throat tightened. "Sometimes grown-ups write things down when they're stressed," I replied carefully. Anthony didn't look convinced. His gaze was steady. Analytical. Observing. I realized something then. Mark and Rebecca thought they were the only ones documenting. They weren't. When the emergency temporary custody hearing date arrived in the mail, I held the envelope for a long time before opening it. It wasn't just about visitation schedules. It was about removal. They were preparing to relocate my son across state lines under the banner of stability. I folded the notice carefully and placed it back on the table. They believed I was disorganized. Emotional. Reactive. They believed I didn't understand strategy. They were wrong. Because if this was a game of documentation, of evidence, of narrative control, I was done being the subject. I was about to become the author. I hired the forensic accountant before I told Mark I was fighting back. His name was Daniel Mercer. Mid-40s. Former federal auditor. Calm in a way that felt mathematical rather than comforting. He didn't react emotionally when I explained what I suspected. He asked for access. Statements. Dates. "Start with the college fund," he said. "Money leaves footprints. Even when people think it doesn't." The college fund had once felt sacred. We opened it when Anthony was a week old. I remember holding him in the hospital chair while Mark filled out the paperwork online. We had promised each other that no matter what happened, our son's future would be secure. Now, nearly $200,000 had been siphoned into a consulting entity I'd never agreed to. Daniel worked quietly for 3 days before calling me back. "They didn't just move it," he said. "They fragmented it." Fragmented. Mark had transferred the money from the education account into the LLC in increments just under reporting thresholds. From there, portions were converted into cryptocurrency through an exchange platform. The rest was routed through layered sub-accounts before consolidating again. Timing, I asked. Daniel paused. The largest transfers occurred within 2 weeks of the LLC formation, which had been 4 months before the divorce filing. This hadn't been panic. It had been planning. When I ended the call, I sat in my car outside the coffee shop where I had taken it. My hands rested on the steering wheel. I stared at nothing. He hadn't left me impulsively. He had been preparing an exit strategy while still sleeping beside me. Daniel sent over additional documentation the following afternoon. Rental application records in Colorado. Assigned inquiry with a school district outside Denver. Submitted 2 weeks after the initial asset transfers. Anthony's name was listed as a dependent in the inquiry. Colorado wasn't hypothetical. It was scheduled. The realization felt like being punched in slow motion. I waited until Anthony came home from school before confronting Mark. I didn't yell. I didn't accuse. I simply laid the rental application on the kitchen counter. You want to explain this? I asked. Mark glanced at the paper and shrugged. Exploring options isn't illegal. Applying to enroll our son in another state without telling me is more than exploring. Rebecca appeared in the doorway like she had been waiting for her cue. She wore a fitted gray dress and carried her ever-present folder. Relocation considerations are common in custody restructuring, she said smoothly. Especially when financial stability improves. She didn't look at me like a rival. She looked at me like a case file. You filed that inquiry before the divorce petition, I said. Mark's jaw tightened. You're overreacting? That word again. Overreacting. It was their favorite. I didn't respond. I simply gathered the paper and walked upstairs. Anthony was sitting at his desk. Pieces of a robotics kit spread across the surface. He didn't look up when I entered. Are we moving? He asked quietly. The question stopped me. Why would you think that? I asked carefully. I saw Dad looking at houses on his computer, he said. And he asked me if I liked mountains. I swallowed. Nothing is decided, I said. You're staying right here. Anthony nodded. But his eyes didn't leave the small circuit board in his hands. He was processing, calculating. That night, I couldn't sleep. I opened my laptop and accessed the shared cloud account Mark had once used for family photo backups. Most folders were locked, but system logs sometimes linger longer than people expect. There, buried in activity history, was a deleted file reference. Video_ARG_0423. MOV. The date was familiar. April 23rd. The night Mark told me he wanted a divorce? The file was no longer accessible. It required a password reset I didn't have. But the existence of it mattered. Why record that conversation? Unless he had expected me to react. I remembered that night clearly now. The way he had pressed me. The way he had repeated phrases until I cried. The way he had stayed strangely calm while I unraveled. He had been harvesting. The next morning, Daniel called again. There's more, he said. Some of the crypto wallet activity aligns exactly with custody preparation dates. That's not coincidence. It's motive, I replied. Exactly. I met with my attorney later that week. She reviewed Daniel's preliminary findings without visible emotion. This changes leverage, she said finally. If we can prove asset concealment and premeditated relocation, the court will question everything. Is it enough? I asked. It's a start. A start felt fragile. That evening, Mark attempted another conversation. We don't have to make this ugly, he said from the doorway of the living room. If you cooperate, this can be smoother. Smoother for who? I asked. For Anthony, he replied automatically. Anthony's name had become a shield. You filed for emergency custody, I said evenly. You drained his college fund? You applied to move him across the country. Mark's eyes hardened. You're unstable right now. You don't even hear yourself. I felt the familiar spark of anger rise. The urge to defend, To shout. Instead, I exhaled. Good night, Mark. The next day, I noticed something new. Anthony was carrying an old cracked phone I thought had stopped working months ago. He kept it in his backpack, slipping it out occasionally when he thought I wasn't looking. Does that thing even turn on? I asked casually. He hesitated. Sometimes, he said. Later that evening, he lingered at the kitchen table while I reviewed legal documents. Mom, he said quietly, if someone lies in court, do they get in trouble? I looked at him carefully. Yes, I answered. Eventually, he nodded once. That was all. But something in his expression told me he knew more than he was saying. Mark and Rebecca believed they were the only ones planning months in advance. They believed they were the only ones thinking strategically. They forgot one thing. Children see more than adults assume. And sometimes, they record it. The first temporary custody hearing felt less like a legal proceeding and more like a performance I hadn't rehearsed for. The courtroom was smaller than I expected. Beige walls. A state seal mounted behind the judge's bench. Rows of wooden seats polished smooth by decades of other families falling apart. Mark arrived 10 minutes early. As always, he wore a charcoal suit and carried himself with the calm of someone confident in his outcome. Rebecca walked beside him. Not as official counsel, but close enough to whisper, they looked aligned. I felt exposed. When the hearing began, Mark's attorney stood with polished ease. His tone was measured, almost concerned. Your Honor, this is about stability, he said. Our client is deeply worried about the emotional volatility and financial unpredictability in the mother's household. Volatility, unpredictability. Words that landed like quiet blows. They projected a timeline onto the courtroom screen. A visual chart mapping my so-called emotional episodes. Dates I had cried after my mother's hospitalization. The week I lost a long-term freelance contract. The afternoon Anthony had a fever, and I sent a frantic text message asking Mark to come home early. Each moment reframed as evidence. My attorney objected to tone. The judge allowed it to proceed. Then came the financial angle. Freelance income fluctuates significantly. Mark's lawyer said, holding up printed bank statements. Utilities have lapsed twice in the past 6 months. Utilities that Mark himself had shifted and delayed. He didn't mention that. He didn't mention the allowance system he had implemented, or the restricted account access. He presented numbers without context. And context is everything in family court. Rebecca passed him a document mid-sentence. He adjusted smoothly. Additionally, he continued, we have concerns regarding relocation instability should the mother attempt to change residence. Relocation. My stomach dropped. That was new. When it was my turn to speak, the judge asked me about my daily routine with Anthony. I described mornings, breakfast, school drop-off, homework supervision, robotics club meetings, the way he liked his sandwiches cut diagonally because triangles taste better. I kept my voice even. Deliberate. Then Mark's attorney displayed a photograph. My kitchen. Messy counters. Dishes in the sink. Laundry basket on a chair. This was taken during a period of illness, he said. Would you describe this as stable? Heat rushed up my neck. I had the flu, I replied calmly. Anthony was cared for. The house was not staged for photography. The judge's expression didn't change. Mark didn't look at me. He stared straight ahead. Anthony sat in the second row beside my sister. His hands gripped the edge of the bench. He wasn't fidgeting. He was watching. Then came the moment that shifted everything. Mark's attorney casually referenced a potential career opportunity in Colorado. My head turned sharply. Colorado. We believe a relocation would significantly increase, Mr. Collins's earning potential and provide long-term stability. The attorney continued. When was this opportunity secured? The judge asked. Discussions are ongoing, he replied smoothly. Discussions. Like they hadn't already looked at school districts. Like rental applications hadn't already been submitted. My attorney requested clarification on timing. The judge took notes. I realized with sickening clarity that this wasn't reactive. It was sequenced. LLC formation. Fund transfers. Custody filing. Relocation positioning. A removal plan. When the judge announced the temporary ruling, my pulse roared in my ears. Pending further evidentiary review, she said. The court will expand the father's parenting time. Expanded. Not full custody, but not safety either. Additionally, temporary oversight of certain joint financial decisions would remain under Mark's administrative control until further accounting could be presented. Administrative control. My attorney squeezed my hand briefly under the table. It wasn't a total loss, but it wasn't a win. Outside the courtroom, Mark approached me with infuriating calm. "This doesn't have to be ugly," he said quietly. "If you cooperate." "Cooperate with what?" I asked. "With what's best for Anthony." He always framed control as protection. Rebecca stood a few feet behind him. Silent. Observant. I didn't respond. That evening, the house felt different. Not because of the ruling. Because of the shift. Anthony would now be spending longer stretches at Mark's apartment under the expanded arrangement. The first night he packed his small overnight bag. I knelt in front of him. "You know I love you," I said. "I know," he replied. His voice was steady, but his eyes were older. After he left with Mark, I walked into the home office and opened the shared cloud system. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew something existed. There it was, a folder labeled court evidence. Not hidden, not encrypted, just confidently stored. Inside were screenshots of arguments, photos, notes, receipts, time-stamped summaries of conversations I barely remembered. He had been documenting me for months. Strategically, I clicked on a subfolder from 3 weeks earlier. There was a file titled Relocation Timeline. My hands went cold. Before I could open it, I heard the sound of Mark's car returning. He must have forgotten something. I closed the laptop quickly and stepped away. Later that night, when the house was quiet again, I went into his office drawer looking for something specific. The old cracked phone he had replaced months ago. It wasn't there. I stood in the dark office holding the empty space where it should have been. For the first time, a new thought formed. What if I wasn't the only one who had seen too much? Upstairs, Anthony's room felt too still without him. I sat on the edge of his bed and stared at the robotics project on his desk. Mark thought he was the strategist. Rebecca thought she was the architect. They believed I was reacting to events. They didn't realize I was mapping them now. And if they were building a case against me, I was going to dismantle it piece by piece. The first time Rebecca took the stand in a preliminary evidentiary hearing, she looked like she belonged there. Composed. Measured. Professionally detached. She wore a navy sheath dress and spoke in calm. Structured sentences. Not emotional. Not reactive. Just precise. I observed patterns of instability over time, she said. Hands folded neatly. My concern was always the child's well-being. Observed. As if she had been an objective researcher studying an experiment. She described moments from my life with unsettling clarity. The afternoon I cried after losing a client. The week my mother was hospitalized. The time I sent a frustrated text at midnight because Anthony wouldn't sleep. Each story extracted from context and presented as symptom. My attorney cross-examined gently at first. Ms. Shaw, how often were you physically present during these alleged episodes? Rebecca paused briefly. I was not physically present for most. So your assessment was based on documentation provided to you? Yes. By Mr. Collins? Yes. She didn't hesitate. She didn't falter. She believed in the structure of her argument more than the humanity of it. Sitting there, I understood something new. This wasn't just an affair. This was collaboration. After court, I met Daniel again. He had traced more of the cryptocurrency transfers. The funds from Anthony's college account had been converted into digital assets within days of the LLC's formation. Intent matters, he said quietly. And timing tells intent. The most damning piece wasn't just the transfer. It was the sequence. First, the LLC was registered under Rebecca's oversight. Then the education fund was moved. Then relocation research began. Then the divorce filing. Then the emergency custody petition. A checklist. I brought this information to my attorney, who leaned back in her chair and exhaled slowly. They built a financial case, she said. Now we build one back. In the meantime, life inside the house became something between surveillance and theater. Mark moved with deliberate calm. He kept his phone angled away from me. He referenced court strategy in passing conversations, as if reminding me that everything was being recorded. One evening, he brought up therapy. For your own good, he said. It would show the court you're taking responsibility. Responsibility for what? For grieving my mother. For being exhausted. For trusting my husband. We attended one session together. The therapist referenced notes provided in advance. Mark's notes. Phrases I recognized from court filings were now appearing in clinical language. Emotional dysregulation under stress. Difficulty maintaining composure. I realized halfway through the session that it wasn't counseling. It was documentation. I stopped sharing. I began observing. Anthony noticed. Why don't you talk as much anymore? He asked me one night while we were doing homework at the kitchen table. I'm just thinking more, I replied. He nodded as if that made sense. Mark attempted another provocation a few days later. He criticized my freelance income in front of Anthony. He questioned my budgeting decisions loudly enough for the house to carry the sound. You can't even maintain stable revenue, he said. How do you expect to provide long-term security? I felt the heat rise in my chest. He was baiting me. Anthony looked between us. Silent. I inhaled slowly. My income fluctuates because it's project-based, I said evenly. That doesn't make it unstable. Mark smirked slightly, disappointed by my lack of eruption. Later that night, I heard him typing, "Court evidence." The phrase echoed in my mind. I checked the shared cloud logs again and discovered something new. A folder labeled Draft Evaluations. Inside were early versions of the psychological summary Rebecca had referenced in court. The language had evolved over time. Each revision sharper, more pointed. This wasn't a spontaneous concern. It was iterative. They had tested which phrases sounded most credible. I printed the versions quietly and added them to the growing folder in my own desk drawer. Meanwhile, Daniel uncovered something else. One of the crypto wallets linked to the LLC had been accessed from an IP address matching Mark's office network at work. That mattered. It meant corporate resources might have been involved. If that thread was pulled, consequences would extend beyond family court. When I told my attorney, she nodded slowly. Pressure changes negotiations, she said. But the pressure wasn't just legal. It was psychological. Mark's demeanor shifted slightly after the temporary ruling. He grew more confident. He began discussing Colorado openly, mentioning mountain schools and better STEM programs for Anthony, as if it were inevitable, as if I were already erased. One evening, Anthony asked quietly, "If Dad moves, do I have to go?" The question struck deeper than any court filing. Not unless the court says so. I answered carefully. He looked down at his hands. Dad says judges like stability. They also like honesty, I said. Anthony didn't respond. But I noticed something else. The old cracked phone had reappeared in his backpack. I didn't ask. Not yet. That night, after Anthony fell asleep, I sat alone in the living room. The betrayal no longer felt chaotic. It felt structured. Rebecca wasn't just assisting. She was orchestrating. Mark wasn't improvising. He was following a blueprint. They believed they had accounted for every reaction I might have. They believed they understood me. What they failed to calculate was endurance. Because while they were drafting evaluations and filing motions, I was building something far more dangerous. Proof. The house no longer felt like a home. It felt like a monitored environment. Every conversation carried weight. Every silence felt recorded. I moved carefully through rooms that once felt safe, choosing my words like they were evidence, Mark rarely raised his voice anymore. That was new. Instead, he documented, I would see him typing after even the smallest disagreement. A quiet exchange about scheduling. A comment about groceries. If my tone shifted even slightly, his fingers moved across the keyboard. I stopped reacting. He noticed, "You're being unusually quiet lately," he said one evening while leaning against the kitchen counter. "I'm tired," I replied. He studied me as if trying to determine whether that sentence could be used later. The financial suffocation tightened gradually. Utilities were transferred fully into his name. The joint credit card was removed from my online access. I had to text him receipts for reimbursement. When I asked for clarity on shared accounts, he said, "It's cleaner for the court if I manage liquidity." Liquidity. He spoke like I was a variable in a spreadsheet. I had always managed social media campaigns with metrics and analytics. I understood structured thinking. But this was different. This was weaponized organization. My freelance accounts began receiving more complaints. Anonymous reviews accusing me of inconsistency. One client terminated a contract citing external concerns about stability. I checked metadata on the flagged emails. They originated from IP addresses tied to our home network. I didn't confront him. Not yet. Instead, I began documenting quietly. Screenshots. Account logs. Email headers. Cloud access timestamps. If he wanted a record, I would build one too. Then came the therapy trap. Mark insisted we attend joint counseling for Anthony's sake. The therapist had notes before we walked in. Structured summaries. Phrases that mirrored court filings. During the session, Mark described me as emotionally unpredictable. He referenced specific dates and times. Precise. Too precise. I realized he wasn't sharing feelings. He was citing a file. When I tried to explain context, the therapist gently redirected the conversation back to patterns. Patterns constructed from his documentation. Halfway through the session, I stopped offering explanations. I observed instead. When we left, Mark seemed satisfied. "That went well," he said. "For who?" I asked. He didn't answer. Anthony watched everything. One night at dinner, he asked, "Why does Dad write things down when you cry?" The question froze the air between us. "Sometimes people take notes when they're worried," I said carefully. Anthony tilted his head slightly. "He doesn't look worried," he said. "No, he didn't." A few days later, Mark attempted to provoke me again. He criticized my income in front of Anthony, questioned my budgeting choices, suggested I was incapable of long-term planning. "You're defensive," he said when I pushed back slightly. I stopped mid-sentence. That was the trigger. Defensive. Reactive. Emotional. The vocabulary of instability. I inhaled slowly. "You're entitled to your opinion," I replied calmly. The disappointment flickered across his face. He wanted escalation. He wanted proof. Later that night, I accessed the shared cloud again. There it was. A folder labeled Court Evidence. Subfolders by month. Screenshots. Annotated notes. Photos of the kitchen. Receipts highlighted in yellow. Text messages with timestamps circled. He had been curating a narrative. I opened one document titled Incident Log. Each entry summarized moments from our life with detached analysis. Subject appeared agitated after freelance rejection. Subject displayed heightened emotional response during financial discussion. Subject. Not wife. Not partner. Subject. My chest tightened, but I didn't cry. Instead, I scrolled further. There was a draft relocation timeline. A checklist including increased documented instability frequency prior to final hearing. Increase. The word felt surgical. I closed the laptop quietly. Upstairs, I passed Anthony's room. His light was still on. He was sitting at his desk, the old cracked phone beside him. The screen glowed faintly. I paused at the doorway. "Shouldn't that thing be dead?" I asked gently. He hesitated before answering. "I fixed it." Of course he did. He loved taking things apart and rebuilding them. "What are you doing with it?" I asked. Just playing with settings, he said. His voice was calm. Too calm. I didn't push. Because I had started to understand something. Anthony wasn't just watching. He was learning. The emergency custody hearing was approaching fast. Mark mentioned it casually, as if discussing a calendar appointment. They'll want stability, he said one evening. Judges prefer predictable environments. Predictable. As if I were chaos. As if love was unpredictable but control wasn't. That night, I sat alone in the dark living room. Gaslighting doesn't start loudly. It starts in footnotes, in subtle redefinitions, in quiet reframing of reality. He had slowly shifted language around me, from emotional to unstable, from overwhelmed to volatile, from partner to risk. But language cuts both ways. Because if instability was their narrative, intent was mine. The next morning, I discovered something small but telling. The old cracked phone was missing from Mark's office drawer. I stood there staring at the empty space. Anthony had asked a question days earlier. If someone lies in court, do they get in trouble? At the time, I thought it was curiosity. Now I wasn't so sure. Mark believed he was controlling the record. He believed he was documenting me into removal. What he didn't realize was that documentation works in both directions. And somewhere in this house, a record was forming that he hadn't written. The morning of the final custody hearing arrived too quickly and yet not quickly enough. I woke before my alarm. The sky outside still dark over our Massachusetts neighborhood. For a moment, I lay there listening to the silence of the house, knowing it might be one of the last mornings that felt familiar. Anthony was already awake when I knocked on his door. He was sitting at his desk, fully dressed, staring at something in his hands. When he looked up, he slipped it into his backpack. "You ready?" I asked. He nodded. Mark drove separately to the courthouse. Of course he did. Optics mattered. When I walked into Suffolk County Family Court with my attorney beside me, I saw them immediately. Mark in a tailored suit, shoulders squared. Rebecca at his side, composed, whispering something that made him smirk. They looked confident, like the outcome was already printed. Inside the courtroom, everything felt magnified. The scrape of chairs, the shuffle of paper, the low murmur of attorneys preparing arguments. When the judge entered, the air shifted. Mark's attorney opened with a polished statement about stability and structure. "Your Honor, this case is about ensuring the long-term well-being of a minor child in a stable, predictable environment." Predictable. The word echoed again. They displayed a chart on the courtroom monitor, a timeline mapping my alleged emotional volatility. Dates highlighted in red. Screenshots enlarged. There was a photo of me crying in the kitchen the night Mark told me he wanted a divorce. The angle suggested it had been taken from the hallway. I hadn't even known he was photographing me. "Would you describe this as controlled behavior?" the attorney asked when I was called to testify. I kept my voice steady. I would describe it as a woman reacting to her marriage ending. A faint murmur moved through the room. They shifted to finances next. Bank statements projected on screen. Highlighted fluctuations in my freelance income. "Does this reflect stable earnings?" The attorney pressed. "It reflects project-based work," I replied, "which I have maintained while raising our son full-time." Rebecca leaned forward and passed another document to the attorney. He adjusted seamlessly. "There are also concerns about potential relocation instability," he added. "Mr. Collins has secured a professional opportunity in Colorado that significantly improves financial prospects." Secured. So now it was official. My attorney objected to characterization. But the damage was done. Colorado was no longer theoretical. The judge asked Mark directly about the timeline. He answered smoothly. Too smoothly. "Discussions began earlier this year," he said. Earlier this year. 4 months before filing. Before moving the college fund. Before the emergency custody motion. I felt the pieces aligning in my mind like a blueprint. When Rebecca was called as a witness, she took the stand with practiced calm. She described me clinically, as if I were a case study. I observed patterns of emotional dysregulation, she said. My professional concern has always been the child's stability. Observed. From where? From Mark's documentation. My attorney questioned her about her direct presence during these so-called episodes. Were you physically present during the majority of these incidents? She asked. No, Rebecca admitted. But documentation can be reliable. Documentation. The word hung in the air. Then came the provocation. Mark's attorney referenced the night I lost a major freelance contract. He displayed a screenshot of a text message I had sent Mark. I feel like I'm failing. Would you say that indicates emotional instability? He asked. I felt the room watching me. I felt Mark watching me. Waiting. I inhaled slowly. It indicates vulnerability, I said, which is not the same thing. For a split second, I saw irritation flash across Mark's face. I wasn't performing the role he needed. The judge leaned forward. Is there any additional evidence either party wishes to present before we recess? She asked. Mark's attorney glanced at Rebecca. Rebecca gave a small nod. No further evidence at this time, he said confidently. They thought they had secured the narrative. I felt Anthony shift behind me. I turned slightly and saw him standing. My heart stopped. He stepped forward before anyone could stop him. Your Honor, he said. Voice clear but small in the large room. Can I show you something? A ripple moved through the courtroom. Mark stiffened instantly. This is inappropriate. His attorney began. The judge raised a hand. What would you like to show me? She asked gently. Anthony pulled the old cracked phone from his backpack. The one Mark thought was broken. The one that had gone missing from his drawer. It's a video, Anthony said. From our house. Mark's face drained of color. Rebecca's composure fractured for the first time. I realized in that suspended moment that whatever was on that device, it had been waiting. The judge looked at the bailiff. Then back at Anthony. We will review it, she said carefully. Anthony walked toward the clerk's desk with steady steps. Mark half rose from his seat. That device hasn't been authenticated, his attorney started. But the judge's gaze was sharp now. Sit down, she said. As the phone was connected to the courtroom monitor, the screen flickered. I didn't know exactly what my son had recorded. But I knew one thing. Mark and Rebecca believed they controlled the documentation. They believed they were the only ones building a case. They were about to learn they weren't. The screen flickered once before the image came into focus. It was our living room. Not the staged version with folded blankets and polished coffee tables. But the real one. The one with Anthony's robotics kit half assembled on the rug and a stack of unopened mail on the side table. The camera angle was low, slightly tilted. Hidden. Mark's voice came first. She has no idea how to read the accounts, he said, laughing softly. She barely checks the statements. My breath left my body. The courtroom was silent except for the faint echo of his recorded voice. Rebecca's voice followed. Calm and measured. That's why we needed the LLC in place before filing, she said. Once the transfers are fragmented, it's harder to trace. And if she reacts emotionally, it strengthens the custody angle. My heart pounded so loudly I thought I might pass out. On the screen, Mark leaned back on our couch. Relaxed. Confident. I just have to keep documenting, he said. Every breakdown. Every overreaction. The judge will see instability. Rebecca nodded in the video. Make sure the relocation inquiry is submitted before the temporary hearing, she added. If the move looks inevitable, it shifts the leverage. Colorado. It had never been hypothetical. In the courtroom, Mark stood abruptly. This is out of context, he said sharply. That's not... Sit down, the judge repeated, her voice firm. The video continued. If I get full custody, Mark said casually, I won't have to deal with long-term child support. Clean break. Rebecca's response was quiet but clear. Exactly. Once relocation is approved, her financial position weakens. No assets. No proximity. No leverage. The words hit harder than the affair ever had. No assets. No proximity. No leverage. No mother. Anthony stood still near the clerk's desk as the recording played. His hands were steady. The video ended with the sound of a door closing. Silence swallowed the room. The judge leaned back slowly. Mark looked like someone had pulled the floor out from under him. That recording is inadmissible without authentication. His attorney insisted. The judge turned to my attorney. Can this device be verified? My attorney didn't hesitate. We can provide metadata timestamps and corroborate with financial transfer dates already submitted. Daniel had prepared us for this possibility. We had documentation of crypto transactions matching the exact week referenced in the recording. The judge requested the bailiff secure the device. Mark attempted to move toward Anthony. "Give me that," he hissed. The bailiff stepped between them. I had never seen Mark look afraid before. Now I did. Rebecca tried to regain composure. "Even if this conversation occurred," she said carefully, "it reflects strategic financial planning, not misconduct." The judge's gaze sharpened. "Strategic financial planning that was undisclosed during divorce proceedings?" she asked. Rebecca didn't answer immediately. My attorney rose. "Your Honor, the forensic accounting report already before the court outlines undisclosed transfers from a minor's education fund into a shell entity formed under Mrs. Shaw's oversight. The timing aligns precisely with the statements made in this recording." The word shell echoed heavily. Mark shook his head rapidly. "That money was invested," he insisted. "It wasn't concealed. In a cryptocurrency wallet accessed from your office network." My attorney replied calmly. The room shifted. The judge requested a brief recess. When she returned, her tone had changed entirely. "This court takes asset disclosure seriously," she began. "Failure to disclose material financial information during custody proceedings raises significant concern." She turned to Mark. "Did you transfer funds from your child's education account prior to filing for divorce?" Mark hesitated. "Yes," he admitted finally. And did you inform the court of those transfers in your initial financial affidavit?" Silence. Rebecca interjected quickly. "We believed the transfers fell within discretionary marital management. You are not counsel in this matter." The judge cut her off. Rebecca's face flushed. The judge continued. "This court is also deeply concerned about evidence suggesting deliberate provocation and documentation of emotional responses for strategic advantage." She looked at Anthony. "Young man, when did you record this?" Anthony swallowed but answered clearly. "The night Dad told Mom he wanted a divorce." "Why did you record it?" He hesitated for a fraction of a second. "Because he was laughing." The simplicity of that answer broke something inside me. The judge's expression softened briefly before returning to professional neutrality. "Relocation requests are hereby suspended pending full investigation," she announced. "All disputed financial accounts are temporarily frozen." Mark opened his mouth, but no words came out. "Additionally," the judge continued, "this matter will be referred for review regarding potential non-disclosure and misrepresentation." Rebecca's composure fractured completely. Anthony walked back to my side and sat down quietly. I took his hand. It was warm, steady. For months, I had felt cornered, reduced, framed. Now the frame was cracking. Mark's narrative had relied on controlled documentation, on curated evidence, on portraying me as unstable and financially incapable. In less than 3 minutes, my 9-year-old son dismantled it. The judge looked directly at Mark. "This court prioritizes the best interest of the child," she said. "And integrity matters." Integrity, a word Mark had forgotten. As the session adjourned for the day, the room buzzed with restrained conversation. Mark no longer looked confident. He looked exposed. Rebecca avoided eye contact entirely. Anthony squeezed my hand gently. I realized then that revenge had never been about humiliation. It was about truth. And truth, once played out loud, cannot be unrecorded. The courtroom felt different when we returned the following week. Not quieter, sharper. Mark no longer walked in with casual confidence. His steps were measured, shoulders slightly tense. Rebecca stayed 2 steps behind him this time. No longer whispering. The judge entered with a stack of updated filings in front of her. After reviewing the newly submitted evidence, she began. This court has serious concerns regarding financial non-disclosure and potential manipulation of proceedings. There was no warmth in her tone. Mark's attorney stood, attempting composure. Your Honor, my client maintains that all transfers were legitimate investment strategies within marital discretion. Discretion does not eliminate disclosure obligations. The judge replied. The words landed cleanly. Daniel had prepared a detailed affidavit outlining the crypto transfers, the dates, the fragmentation, the wallet activity tied to Mark's corporate network. My attorney presented it without flourish. This is not an investment issue, she said calmly. It is an asset concealment issue. Mark's jaw tightened. He looked at Rebecca briefly. She did not look back. The judge turned to me. Mrs. Collins, are you prepared to assume full financial management responsibilities if necessary? The question startled me. Yes. I answered steadily. I have already restructured my accounts and secured independent oversight. That was true. In the week since the video, I had opened new accounts, contacted my freelance clients, and provided clarifications about the anonymous complaints. 2 had agreed to resume contracts once documentation cleared my name. The narrative was shifting. Then came the relocation issue. This court finds the relocation inquiry was initiated prior to formal custody adjudication. The judge said, such premeditation weighs heavily against the petitioner. Premeditation. Mark shifted in his seat. His attorney attempted damage control. The Colorado opportunity was exploratory. The rental application was signed. My attorney interjected. And the school inquiry included the minor's name. The judge did not need to hear more. Relocation is denied pending final custody determination, she stated firmly. A breath I hadn't realized I was holding finally escaped. But the hearing wasn't over. Rebecca was called forward again. This time, her voice lacked its earlier smoothness. You advised Mr. Collins on drafting communications and documentation strategies, the judge asked. I provided general guidance, Rebecca replied carefully. Guidance that included framing emotional responses as instability. Silence. Guidance that aligned precisely with asset transfers and custody filing timelines. Rebecca's composure fractured. I did not intend to mislead the court, she said. Intent. It always came back to intent. My attorney introduced the earlier draft psychological summaries I had printed from the cloud. The revision history showed incremental sharpening of language. Phrases evolving from stress-related responses to emotional volatility. The judge reviewed them slowly. This suggests a pattern of narrative construction, she said quietly. Narrative construction. The very thing they accused me of lacking control over. Mark attempted one final defense. I was protecting my son, he said. The judge looked at him directly. Protecting him from what? He hesitated. Instability, he repeated weakly. Anthony sat behind me, silent but alert. The judge leaned forward. The recording presented last week demonstrates calculated provocation and strategic documentation for leverage. That does not align with parental protection. The air felt electric. For months, I had felt like I was on trial. Now the focus had shifted. The judge outlined preliminary findings. Undisclosed financial transfers. Questionable advisory involvement. Preemptive relocation efforts. These matters warrant further review, she said. In the interim, primary physical and legal custody will remain with Mrs. Collins. Remain. The word steadied me. Mark's face drained again. Structured visitation would be maintained under supervision guidelines. Financial accounts linked to disputed transfers would remain frozen pending investigation. And then came the final shift. This court also directs that transcripts and submitted materials be forwarded to appropriate professional review bodies regarding potential ethical violations. The judge added, glancing briefly at Rebecca. Rebecca closed her eyes for a moment. The consequences were no longer theoretical. When the session ended, Mark tried to approach me in the hallway. "We can still work something out," he said, voice lower than I had ever heard it. I looked at him calmly. "You already did," I replied. Anthony stood beside me, taller somehow than he had been a week ago, outside the courthouse. The autumn air felt crisp and unfamiliar. I realized something important. They had built their strategy on the assumption that I would collapse under pressure, that I would react emotionally, that I would fail to understand the financial layers. They underestimated endurance. They underestimated documentation in reverse. And most of all, they underestimated a child who listens when adults think he isn't paying attention. As we walked toward the car, Anthony slipped his hand into mine. "Are we okay?" he asked quietly. "Yes," I said. For the first time in months, I believed it. The final ruling day arrived with a strange kind of quiet. Not the suffocating quiet of uncertainty, the steady kind. I stood outside the courthouse with Anthony's hand in mine, watching people move in and out of the building that had held our future hostage for months. Mark arrived alone this time. Rebecca was nowhere in sight. When we entered the courtroom, the tension felt different. Not explosive. Conclusive, the judge reviewed her notes for several long moments before speaking. "This court has completed review of all submitted financial documents, forensic reports, and testimonial evidence," she began. Her voice carried weight. "Mr. Collins failed to disclose substantial transfers from a minor's education account into a limited liability entity prior to filing for divorce." Mark shifted slightly. "The timing of these transfers, in conjunction with recorded statements presented to this court, demonstrates intent to conceal assets during custody proceedings." Intent. The word sealed it. I felt Anthony's fingers tighten around mine. The judge continued. "Furthermore, the attempted relocation to Colorado prior to adjudication reflects premeditated effort to alter the child's primary residence without judicial approval." She paused. "This court finds that such conduct weighs heavily against the petitioner's claim of acting in the child's best interest." For months, those words, best interest, had been used against me. Now they were being returned. "Primary physical and legal custody of the minor child is hereby awarded to Mrs. Collins," the judge stated clearly. The room seemed to exhale. Anthony looked up at me, eyes wide but calm. Mark remained still, face expressionless. "Mr. Collins shall retain structured visitation under conditions outlined in this order," the judge continued. "All financial accounts associated with undisclosed transfers will remain under review pending potential civil penalties." Civil penalties. Not hypothetical anymore. "Additionally," she added, "this court refers materials pertaining to advisory involvement and potential misrepresentation to appropriate oversight authorities." Rebecca's absence suddenly made sense. The judge concluded with something that stayed with me long after. "Custody is not a strategic asset," she said. "It is a responsibility rooted in honesty." Honesty. A simple word that had nearly been buried under documentation and manipulation. When the gavel struck, it didn't feel dramatic. It felt definitive. Outside the courtroom, Mark attempted to speak again. "This didn't have to go this way," he said quietly. "You chose the way," I replied. He looked at Anthony. "I was trying to provide stability," he insisted. Anthony's response was simple. "You were laughing." Mark had no answer for that. In the weeks that followed, consequences unfolded methodically. Daniel confirmed that most of the diverted college funds were recoverable. Cryptocurrency trails are complicated, but not invisible. Mark's employer placed him on administrative review once the forensic findings reached corporate compliance. Accessing digital wallets through company networks had consequences. Rebecca's name appeared in a professional conduct inquiry notice that circulated quietly through local legal circles. I didn't celebrate. I reorganized. I opened new accounts solely in my name. Established independent financial oversight. Contacted every freelance client with documented proof that the anonymous complaints had originated internally from shared IP addresses. 2 returned immediately. 1 apologized. Anthony resumed Robotics Club without the shadow of relocation. He seemed lighter, less watchful. One evening, 6 months after the ruling, we sat at the small kitchen table in our new townhouse. Smaller than the old house. Quieter. Safer. "Why didn't you tell me sooner?" I asked gently, finally ready to hear the answer. He looked thoughtful. "If I told you, you would have confronted him," he said. "And he would have stopped talking like that." "You were protecting the timing," I said softly. He nodded. "You always say information is power," he added. I had said that in marketing meetings, in strategy sessions, in casual conversations about algorithms. I hadn't realized he was listening that closely. "They thought I was weak," I said quietly. "More to myself than to him." Anthony shrugged. "They thought you didn't notice things." I smiled faintly. They were wrong. What hurt most in the end wasn't the affair. It wasn't even the money. It was the attempt to redefine me, to shrink me into a diagnosis, to frame exhaustion as instability, to turn vulnerability into liability. But vulnerability, I learned, is not weakness. It is context. And context changes everything. I tucked Anthony into bed that night the same way I had for years. The room looked different in this house, but the rhythm was the same. As I turned off the light, he said quietly, "We're okay." "Mom." "Yes?" I answered. The war had never been about revenge in the way people imagine it. It was about restoration, about refusing to be erased, about understanding that documentation can cut both ways, and about recognizing that sometimes the smallest person in the room carries the strongest truth. They thought they were building a case against me. What they built instead was the evidence that set us free. The quiet after the ruling was louder than the courtroom ever was. For months, every day had been filled with filings, deadlines, court dates, strategy calls. Then suddenly, there was space. Mark moved into a short-term apartment across town while the financial investigation continued. The house felt unfamiliar without the constant hum of tension. No more late-night typing from his office. No more whispered phone calls. No more careful editing of my tone. Anthony adjusted faster than I expected. He stopped watching the door every time I raised my voice slightly. He stopped asking whether judges liked stability. He started talking about robotics competitions again. The investigation into the diverted college fund moved quietly but steadily. "Daniel kept me updated. Most of it is recoverable," he said during one call. "There will likely be penalties attached." Penalties? I didn't feel vindictive when I heard that. I felt steady. Mark's attorney reached out twice to discuss settlement restructuring. The tone had changed completely. No more talk of relocation. No more references to instability. Now the focus was minimizing civil exposure. I declined any agreement that didn't fully restore Anthony's education fund. I had learned the language. I had learned the leverage. Rebecca's professional review became public record weeks later. A formal ethics inquiry citing advisory overreach and potential involvement in undisclosed asset structuring. She sent one email to my attorney requesting a statement that she had not directly represented Mark in court. I didn't respond personally. Silence can be an answer. Mark requested additional visitation weekends. The judge approved them with conditions. The first exchange after the final order was awkward. We met in a public parking lot as directed by the custody agreement. Mark looked smaller somehow, less composed. "I never wanted it to get this far," he said quietly while Anthony loaded his backpack into the car. "You filed for full custody," I replied. "I thought it would be cleaner," he said. "Cleaner?" He still spoke like a man rearranging paperwork. Anthony hugged me before getting into Mark's car. "I'll be back Sunday," he said. "I know," I replied. And I did. That certainty was everything. Back at the townhouse, I reorganized my office space. I expanded my freelance work into a small consultancy. I accepted 2 new clients and raised my rates. Financial independence no longer felt optional. It felt necessary. One evening, while reviewing invoices, I paused and looked around the small living room. No grand staircase. No wide suburban driveway. But also no surveillance, no curated evidence folders, no weaponized documentation. Just peace. Anthony came downstairs with a stack of papers one afternoon. "They picked my team for the robotics regional," he said, trying to sound casual. "That's amazing," I said, pulling him into a hug. He grinned in a way I hadn't seen in months. Later that night, when he was in bed, I sat alone and reflected on what had hurt the most. Not the affair, not the public humiliation of being called unstable in court. It was the attempt to redefine my motherhood, to turn exhaustion into diagnosis, to use vulnerability as leverage. Gaslighting doesn't always scream. Sometimes it files motions. Sometimes it prints timelines. Sometimes it smiles while calling you emotional. The scariest part had been how close I came to doubting myself. There were nights I reread the psychological summaries and wondered if I was too reactive, too sensitive, too tired. But fatigue is not instability. Grief is not disorder. Being human is not a liability. The difference between collapse and endurance often comes down to documentation. They documented my tears. I documented their intent. Anthony documented the truth. Months later, when I finally asked him why he recorded that night, he didn't hesitate. "You sounded scared," he said. And Dad was laughing. The simplicity of that explanation still breaks me. He hadn't recorded for revenge. He had recorded because something felt wrong. Because a 9-year-old recognized cruelty when he heard it. The court restored custody. The investigation restored finances. But what truly restored me was something else. Clarity. I was never unstable. I was cornered. And when you corner a mother, you don't eliminate her. You focus her. Mark underestimated that. Rebecca underestimated that. They believed structure and language would be enough. They forgot about truth. Now, when I tuck Anthony in at night, there's no shadow of relocation hanging over us. No whispered strategy. Just routine. Homework. Brushed teeth. Light off. "Good night, Mom," he says. "Good night," I answer. We are not the same family we were before. We are smaller, but we are honest. And honesty, I've learned, is the only stability that matters. 6 months after the final ruling, I stopped flinching at the sound of email notifications. For a long time, every ping had meant another filing, another accusation, another attempt to redefine me. Now it meant client confirmations, project approvals, invoices paid on time. Our new townhouse was smaller than the old house, but it felt like it belonged to us. The kitchen was narrow, the living room modest. The stairs creaked if you stepped too hard. There was no guest room for image, no formal dining space for staged holidays. There was space to breathe. Anthony adjusted faster than I did. He pinned his robotics competition badge to the corkboard above his desk like a trophy. He stopped asking whether judges liked stability. He started asking whether he could learn basic coding languages beyond his school curriculum. We rebuilt quietly. The court finalized the financial review 3 months after the ruling. Most of the diverted college fund was recovered, along with penalties for non-disclosure. Mark's access to discretionary transfers was permanently restricted. Child support was structured clearly, documented, enforceable. No more blurred lines. Rebecca's professional review concluded with formal reprimand and probationary oversight. Her name circulated in legal circles in ways she likely never anticipated. I didn't celebrate that. Consequences are not victories. They are corrections. Mark requested additional visitation adjustments twice. The court required co-parenting compliance sessions first. The man who once documented my tone now spoke carefully in mediated settings. It wasn't reconciliation. It was containment. The first time Anthony returned from a full weekend with his father after the final order. He walked in, dropped his backpack, and said, "It's different now." "How?" I asked. "He doesn't laugh like that anymore," he replied. Like that. He didn't need to explain further. One evening, while we were cleaning up after dinner, Anthony asked me something unexpected. "Do you think Dad ever thought he was wrong?" I dried my hands on a dish towel before answering. I think sometimes people convince themselves they're right because it's easier than admitting harm, I said. He nodded thoughtfully. And you? He asked. Did you ever think maybe they were right about you? The question hit closer than he realized. Yes, I admitted. For a moment. Because there had been nights I stared at those psychological summaries and wondered if exhaustion really did look like instability. If grief really did sound like volatility. Gaslighting doesn't always feel dramatic. Sometimes it feels like doubt. But doubt is not truth. I rebuilt more than finances. I rebuilt my voice. I expanded my freelance consultancy into a small agency. I hired one part-time assistant. I stopped apologizing for invoices. I stopped minimizing my expertise in meetings. Financial independence became more than survival. It became identity. On the anniversary of the ruling, Anthony and I took a walk through a nearby park. The air was cool. Leaves just beginning to change. Are we okay now? He asked again. The same way he had months earlier. Yes, I said. We're okay. And this time, it wasn't relief speaking. It was certainty. The betrayal had tried to erase me as a mother. The manipulation had tried to reclassify me as unstable. The custody battle had tried to reduce me to bullet points and exhibits. But what they never understood was this. A mother who is underestimated becomes strategic. A woman who is cornered becomes precise. And truth, once recorded, has a way of surviving the courtroom. Revenge was never about destroying Mark or Rebecca. It was about reclaiming authorship of my own story. They thought they were documenting my collapse. What they documented instead was their intent. And sometimes, that is enough. If you've ever been told you were too emotional when you were simply overwhelmed, if you've ever been underestimated because you chose your family over your career, if you've ever doubted your own stability because someone framed your humanity as weakness, I hope you remember this. Documentation cuts both ways. Truth does not need volume. And sometimes the bravest voice in the room is not the loudest one. It might be the quiet child who refuses to ignore what feels wrong. If this story resonated with you, tell me in the comments what moment changed everything for you. Would you have stayed silent longer? Would you have confronted sooner? Your voice matters here. And if you believe in stories about hidden power, family drama, and women reclaiming their strength when everything seems stacked against them, stay with this channel. Subscribe, share your thoughts, and come back for the next story. Because sometimes the most powerful revenge isn't revenge at all. It's survival and rebuilding stronger than they ever expected. This story is fictionalized for dramatic effect.